Also ich freue mich auch sehr über diese Kooperation hier und die Ringvorlesung ist wirklich eine Möglichkeit, ins Gespräch zu kommen und es hat auch schon, glaube ich, einige sehr interessante Diskussionen bei den letzten Vorträgen gegeben. Ich hoffe, dass wir das jetzt so weiterführen und dass sich diese Gespräche eben auch dazu führen, dass wir immer mehr Möglichkeiten für eine Zusammenarbeit entdecken. Ich habe den Vortrag auf Englisch vorbereitet, die Slides eben auch auf Englisch. Ich weiß von mindestens 1,5 Leuten hier im Raum, dass in Englisch deutlich lieber ist als Deutsch, deswegen würde ich einfach mal sagen, we switch to English now. Okay, so the topic is when and how did globalization begin? Evidence from the opening of the Suez Canal, which was in 1869. This is not quite ancient history, but I hope we still actually find some interesting points for debate. And when we think about the conceptualization of globalization, but also actually the economic consequences of integration. That might, I think, also be applied to totally different contexts, right? You know, especially also in ancient history. So this is, as you see, joint work with a couple of other people. Daniel Bernhofen is an economist working in the area of international trade, the American University in the US. Peter Egger, also a trade economist in Zurich, and Paul Caruana Galicia is now a consultant in London. Sadly, he seems to have left academia, but maybe he's coming back, right? When did globalization begin? Actually, there's an argument also in economic history about that. We used to talk about a first and a second globalization, but there are a couple of economic historians who would argue that globalization started way earlier than in the 19th century. And an argument made by O'Rourke and Williamson is that globalization in a specific modern sense started only in the 19th century. Namely, when we talk about globalization, we might mean that there is an integration of markets, right? That could be factor markets like the labor market or capital market, but particularly also commodity markets. A global scope of that integration, so we're talking about actually the integration of just places that are very, very far apart. And it's an integration that actually affects bulk commodities, right? Bulk commodities essentially here in the sense of commodities that are that have a very low unit value, a very low value of 1 unit. Think, for example, about grain, right? In contrast to things like spices or bullion. Okay, and the point is that only if you have an integration of bulk commodities, you're going to see that the integration of markets has actually an effect on the allocation of resources on a large scale, right? So that, for example, if you think one prerequisite for an industrialization or actually any movement of the economy out of agriculture is the necessity to free labor, right? Set labor free out of agriculture, and then a prerequisite of that might be that you actually have a market integration for agricultural goods that is sufficient to feed people that work outside of agriculture, also geographically outside of agriculture. So actually this integration of bulk commodities is important because we need to talk about integration of markets that affects the allocation of resources, and that then in turn would also, via this effect on the division of labor, have an effect on the standard of living. And the argument is that this never happened before the 19th century, because previously you had already long distance trade, but this long distance trade was typically only in a particular set of goods, like in spices, think Marco Polo, right? Or actually in bullion and silver and gold and coins, but not in bulk commodities. And therefore it did not affect the allocation of resources on a large enough scale. It affected the distribution of wealth. Maybe some people would become very, very wealthy and rich, but that didn't have really kind of these large-scale allocation effects. It might also have affected the well-being and even the consumption patterns of rich people, but that was largely irrelevant for the majority of the population, right? So in that sense, actually, globalization understood as a process is also the process that would change the composition of what is traded, right? It's not only measured in terms of the quantities traded, that, in pre-globalization times we see little trade and then afterwards we see much more, but it's actually fundamentally about what is traded, okay? This change in the composition. And our paper wants to focus exactly on this changing composition of trade, and we will present a really very simple theoretical framework that links a change in the per unit trade cost, and that's going to be very important, the trade cost per one commodity, or actually 1 unit of weight, if you want, 1 ton. So the change in per unit trade cost on the changing composition of trade. Okay, that's sort of the key dimension, and we will present the simplest possible, I think, framework that delivers that. We will use then evidence from the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 as a quasi-experiment, in the sense that there was a very large and pretty well defined, if you want, shock to unit trade costs, to the cost of shipping 1 ton of whatever commodity from A to B. And we then will look into the composition of trade for a group of countries that were directly affected by that. That's what we call the treatment group, as opposed to another group of countries that was not affected by that, and that is our control group. That is something that economists, empirically working economists, like to do. It's borrowed from medicine, a concept that you actually look for the consequences of something by comparing a treatment group against a control group. Obviously, the idea has to be that these groups are comparable in the first place, right? They share basically similar characteristics. Not sure whether the micro is really working. From time to time it's working. Don't know. For you it's okay? Okay. Well, right. Okay, and okay, so that's the basic idea, right? And of course, if you have questions, then please jump in and ask, right? So the plan for the next 45 or so minutes is going to be this. I present you this theoretical framework, and I hope that is intuitive and makes sense to you. Then I will talk about the historical background, which is going to be relatively important here. It's also fun, to be honest, to think about the opening of the Suez Canal and what happened at that time. But it's also really going to be important to make sense of our results and to understand the challenges that we're actually facing here. And then I'm going to talk first about the trade costs. What do we know about trade costs before and after the opening of the Suez Canal? And when I say trade cost, I actually mean the cost of shipping a good on a vessel between two ports, right? And I will be very specific about the ports I'm talking about, right? And okay, and then I present you the empirical approach and, of course, the data that we use here, and the results, step by step, and some conclusions. And hopefully we'll have a discussion afterwards, right? So that's the plan, unless you now walk straight out of the room. No. Theoretical framework. Okay, so that is borrowing from earlier papers that were actually talking about the effect of, more generally, transaction costs on demand and on consumption patterns. And we will here more specifically use this framework originally from Borcherding and Silberberg and Hummels and Schieber for our context of explaining the demand at one import destination. Actually think UK, right? The import demand at that place given supply and given income, right? So we will actually assume away changes in supply and changes in income, right? And we will later on in our empirical approach have a simple method to take that into account, right? Okay, there was a question?
Yeah, you have always written transport costs, and then in a few minutes ago you said transaction costs, and I think it's very important for our archaeologists to distinguish what you mean with those two terms.
Well, I just said this original framework we borrow here was more generally about transaction costs, right? But we are here talking specifically about transportation costs, right? So we narrow that down to our particular context, right? Maybe we can come back to that later on, okay? So assume a demand function, right? So a relationship between demand for something and factors that would affect that demand at one given import destination. Think this is a port in the UK, right? Where things from international trade arrive. And think we are talking about the demand for one particular good, maybe grain or more specifically wheat, for example, okay? And the idea is that this demand X at this import location I, for example the UK, for commodity K, wheat, is a function essentially of the prices for this wheat at different possible origins from which you could source that commodity, right? Also the price for a composite good that would take account of, you know, all the other stuff that you might want to consume as well, like rye or, I don't know, rice and beer and whatever. And we have abstracted away from income effects, right? So that's why that's called a Hicksian compensated demand function. We bring that later on back into the picture, but we just want to ignore that at the moment, right? And so there are now, okay, now, so we are looking all the time from the UK, right? And we say, okay, now there's this the import demand for this commodity K from different origins, okay? So that's going to be a price function of the relative prices between competing origins and a composite good controlling for income effects. Okay? So far, makes sense? Anything missing? No. Good. Okay, and then now the point is that we want to be very specific about you know, transportation costs and shipping costs here. So the first thing to note is that there is a price at origin and a price at the destination. And in international trade, we typically say there is a CIF price. That's the price that you see typically in import data, that is including customs, insurance and freight. And an FOB price, that's the price that you would observe quite often in export statistics. That is the price of the good at the origin, or at the port where it's actually loaded on a ship. And FOB means free on board. Okay, and the price P star is this CIF price at the destination, think UK, and P is the price at origin. And we want to say maybe there are different types of transportation costs that matter here. There could be something like an ad valorem component, so an element of transportation cost that is changing systematically with the value of the good shipped. Quite often that would be a characteristic of a tariff, right? You can think that often tariffs are levied on the value of a good, right? So therefore this is a component of the of transportation costs that is proportional to the value. And we call that T. And we say that that might be there. And on top of that, there could be another component that is there, but is not proportional at all, or not even related to the value of the good shipped, right? And we call that F. And this is the per unit shipping cost, because everything here is expressed in per unit terms, right? When we say P, it's actually the price per unit, and F is also the freight or the shipping cost per unit. Okay? Right. And that's actually the theory. Everything else is now kind of what follows from there. As you're going to see, now we think about the effect of an asymmetric change in these per unit shipping costs between destination and origin, right? So that okay, now I'm looking from the UK, and then the shipping cost F of shipping whatever a ton of whatever, right? A unit of whatever to the UK from one of the potential origins is now, for example, going down. What's the effect of that? In order to have a nice formulation that then also can be linked to other sort of theoretical insights, it makes sense to first of all use the formulation of the price elasticity of demand, or more specifically of import demand. And the price elasticity is actually defined as that. It's the change in demand in response to a change in prices relative to the levels of prices in demand. Okay, so that's the typical the formulation of an elasticity, and keep in mind that this is the expression, right? We're going to use that in a moment. No, that's not. Anyway, okay. So the question, more formally stated, is actually this: how does import demand change in response to the change in these shipping costs, and an asymmetric change in shipping costs, and the per unit shipping cost is what we are after, right? So we look into here the relative change of import demand from origin I relative to import demand from origin J in response to change in the per unit shipping cost from J. Okay? And this maps one-to-one into the change of these relative demands in response to a change in the CIF price from origin J, because actually CIF price and per unit shipping rates are one-to-one related, okay, by definition. And now I just use a little kind of formal trick from Borcherding and Silverberg, who expand that relationship. It's actually, so this and that is exactly the same expression, it's just kind of blown up. I do that in order to actually use the elasticities in this expression, because that's going to be useful to see what's going on here, right? So that is the same as that, and that is actually again the same as that. I just have now rearranged terms a bit and reformulate it in such a way that I can use the elasticities. And that shows me something very nice, namely that as long as we're talking about normal goods, that is goods for which I have a price elasticity that is smaller than 0, right? So that price goes up, demand goes down, normal good. And as long as the goods we're talking about, so for example wheat, from two different origins, can be treated as substitutes. That is, the cross price elasticity is positive, meaning that if the price from one origin is going up, then the demand for that same stuff from the other origin is going up, because they're substitutes. I just substitute away from the more expensive stuff, right? As long as these two things hold, I get something that actually is this, namely that I have, this expression is going to be smaller than 0. Meaning what? I have to disappoint you, it's a completely trivial insight. It just means, imagine you're sitting in the K, right, can source wheat from two origins, and then actually the cost of getting something from one of these two origins is going down, right? So therefore, of course, also the price of stuff sourced from this origin is going down. Then I will actually start to buy relatively more from the cheaper good. Well, yes, right? So that's not rocket science. So that is unfortunately completely trivial. But it's just kind of the preparation step to get to something slightly more interesting, which is the next step. Namely, how does that expression, right, so that actually that response of relative demand to a change in these per unit shipping costs change in the per unit value of a good? And intuitively, well, I hope it's intuitive. It would be the effect would be stronger, right? The lower the unit value. Why? Well, because the price that you have to pay at the destination in the UK port has these two elements. It has the price at origin, and it has the shipping cost component, right? And if I say, well, the shipping cost, the per unit shipping cost is massively going down, then that will actually have a stronger knock-on effect on the price at the destination. If the price at origin is relatively small, right, then if the price at origin is relatively high. Also relatively trivial insight, okay? But this is what's driving the entire thing, okay? So that means that just if you have now a change in these shipping costs between places A and B that is relatively big, then this will have very different effects for different types of commodities. It will affect low unit value commodities much more strongly than high unit value commodities. That's everything, right? And I think this is in a way common sense just formalized, and then in the next step using this formalized common sense and test whether this is really in the data and this is really going on. Okay? Do you have questions so far? Okay, so essentially we have now this little theoretical framework, maybe that's already an exaggeration, so that formalization of common sense. And we have two testable implications, namely one trivial thing, that if there is a large decline in these per unit shipping costs, you should see that actually people in the UK will source more stuff from that destination from which now it's cheaper to source from. We should see that in the first place, otherwise we are really in trouble. And secondly, then that this effect should be systematically different for different types of commodities. Okay, and we can just look what's happening. Okay. So far we are all on the same page. Good. Now let's look a little bit into the historic context, what I'm talking about. This is the opening of the Suez Canal, which is actually a major technological breakthrough in the 19th century. There has been a canal, or actually several canals in the area long before. I'm not sure what exactly at this moment we know about these older canals. I suspect that there has been a lot of research also maybe going into that direction, but I take it that the common understanding still is there has been a canal before that, right? But that was definitely closed since the 8th century, and it was not really usable for navigation afterwards, unless Napoleon then arrived in Egypt with his famous expedition and took up the idea that maybe one could reopen this canal, right, and make it usable again, which of course would have major effects on the global economic landscape, right? Because the idea is pretty clear, and we're going to see a map in a minute, that would be pretty annoying for the British, okay? And that is, of course, something Napoleon was very interested in. Napoleon then actually has an expert committee, and they're trying to figure out whether that would be possible, and they make a calculation about the sea levels in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and the story that I have that I read in the literature is that they miscalculated these sea levels and came to the conclusion that the sea levels are dramatically different, which would imply that they would have to introduce locks, to avoid a flooding of a major part of the Nile Delta. Therefore, that would have been a very costly enterprise, and that is why they abandoned the plan altogether, right? However, then a later expedition in the 1840s found out that this was a mistake, right? That the sea levels are actually pretty much the same. So therefore, the whole project would not involve, the construction of locks, and therefore it would probably be economical to do it. And then there is a man called Ferdinand de Lesseps, who a Frenchman who had spent already a couple of years in Egypt, and he was obsessed by this idea and convinced the Viceroy of Egypt, which that time still is part of the Ottoman Empire, to grant him a concession to construct such a canal. And the company is then founded in 1858, the Compagnie Universelle Canal Maritime de Suez, and they indeed start working. They raise the capital, most of which is then coming from France, while they actually try to raise it from all over the world, but at the end of the day, most of the capital is coming from France. And to the big surprise of many, they managed to open the canal in November 1869, right? However, this is what's happening to the share price of the company. So it's listed, already in 1861, and then you see this is the share price in 1869, and you see it's actually collapsing after the opening of the canal. That doesn't look promising, right? So something is going wrong here. To the big surprise, actually, you can already see here that the share price was not always on the rise. So some people have their doubts whether that project would actually succeed, and if it succeeds, how economical it would be. Anyway, then they open the canal and the share price is collapsing. But then you see that after a bit of a bumpy start, it does stabilize, and then in the 1880s it really takes off. So if you actually have deep pockets and a bit of patience, you could really make a lot of money from that. Okay, oops. Okay, so now finally a map. So this is from the British Admiralty. This is the official map used by the British Admiralty, or one of them, you know, in 1888, the chart of the world, and that shows you the major routes that sailing and steam vessels would take from different, you know, to connect different ports. Okay, and what we are interested in is, of course, actually this is the UK. And we will mostly look into Plymouth, because a lot of the vessels were starting or arriving at Plymouth, and then they would go through either here, the Mediterranean, past the Port Said, the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea. This is where all the pirates are, and then this is India, right? And we are mostly interested in actually the trade between the UK and India. We also, as I'm going to show you, have data for different parts of India. So that would be Bombay, that is Madras, and that is Calcutta. And then we also look into the relationships of the UK to South Africa and the so-called West Indies, right? And Canada, okay, as our control group. Okay. But you see already, probably the cutting of the Suez Canal had a pretty dramatic effect on trade costs, right? So you can spare the journey around Africa altogether. That looks like really a big shock to trade costs. And this is why we hope to find some big effects of that, right? Even in the presence of other things happening that would create noise in our empirical setting, this shock should be sufficiently large to actually, you know, show us something. Okay, so as I said, that was a bit of a bumpy start. I'll tell you in a second why. Over time, this company and the trade through the Suez Canal develops brilliantly, especially from a British perspective, which was very annoying to the French, who actually did it. So the Economist put it very nicely in 1869. This is a canal that was cut by French energy and Egyptian money, and actually French-Egyptian money, for British advantage. Okay, so this is what happens. That's really very frustrating from a French perspective, because so you see the solid line is the total tonnage that's passing through the canal, and then this with these squares is the British part of it, you know, the French is hardly visible. So is the German. Germany is taking over the French even then at some point in the 1890s. That is related to the takeoff of Germany that is even visible there, right? But the point here is really most of the trade is essentially British, right? So the British really benefit from that, and now we are looking into this exercise. Okay, there is apparently a big shock to trade costs, opening of the Suez Canal. We have data before and after that, and we're looking into what's happening to UK imports and the composition of UK imports. You know, from stuff coming from different parts of the world. One part of the world is actually India, and we expect that actually over time more is coming from India because the trade costs have gone down. That is trivial. But we also expect that actually more bulky stuff, more low unit value stuff is coming from India, right? That is the slightly less trivial part. Okay, before I go into any empirical findings, let's talk a bit about what else is going on, right? So economists very often like to talk about ceteris paribus. I still call it ceteris paribus. Some people say ceteris paribus. I don't really like that. Anyway, ceteris paribus is not really a world where, you know, where everything else is constant, right? And we can just kind of focus on our little experiment here, because this is the last third of the 19th century and an awful lot of things are happening at the same time, right? So we have to keep that in mind and also see how in our empirical framework we can deal with all that. So one thing that is happening is the American Civil War. Why would that affect trade between the UK and India? Well, for one, because there is a so-called cotton famine happening. Cotton is a very important product for British industry at the time, as you can imagine. And the American Civil War led to a blockade of the southern states, where most of the cotton, in the area of 90%, for example, the Lancashire textiles industry would come from, right? All of a sudden, that source of cotton is not longer available anymore. And the alternative places from which you could get cotton would be Egypt and India. Okay, what we actually have is that right before the opening of the Suez Canal, 61, 65, there is a boom in demand for cotton from Egypt and India. Okay, we have to take that into account, because that is going to mess up our data completely, right? It's a temporary boom, and it's also going away, but that's important to understand. And it's very, very particularly just about this one commodity, which is cotton, okay? Right. Second, things are changing right after the opening of the Suez Canal in terms of international environment. Of course, there's also the Franco-Prussian, Franco-German War. That is relatively, short, and it's not directly affecting, I think, these relationships after 1871. But what is affecting clearly this area is the fact that the Ottoman Empire is getting more and more unstable, and the British Khedive is in financial trouble, and he owns a 44% stake in this company, right? So this viceroy actually owns a big part of the company, and the British government, in a famous move by Benjamin Disraeli, without informing Parliament, buys these 44 stake using the Rothschild bankers in a really kind of night action. They just kind of go there, buy this 44%, inform the British public the other day, and all of a sudden the British government is actually a major stakeholder in this entire Suez enterprise. Okay, so that is important. Another thing that happens briefly afterwards is there is a revolt, an uprising in Egypt, the so-called Rabi revolt in 81, 82, which people don't entirely agree on that, was either just kind of, let's say, a cheap excuse, or it was really, necessitating from an economic point of view the intervention of the British and the French troops to intervene in the Suez Canal. So what happened is that in response to that revolt, the British, in agreement with all the other major European powers, most notably with the French, invade the Suez Canal and occupy the entire Suez Canal zone. that is something that actually then continues until the 1950s, when we had the Suez crisis. Okay, so the British were occupying the whole thing, sitting there, and that, of course, had a very stabilizing effect on trade passing through the Suez Canal, right? From a British perspective, now this is a much more reliable trade route. At the same time, it actually becomes more important than ever to the British Empire, because there's yet another thing happening, which is the First Boers War. If you go back to the nice map, we have seen, oops, yes, okay, right, so we are talking about that here, and that's the Suez Canal, right, and the alternative is, of course, going around Africa, and that alternative is, with the Boers War, actually becoming more dangerous. Okay, so the Suez Canal becomes really, in the 1880s, more important than ever. A final thing that is actually also really important, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a moment, is that at this period of time, there is a very substantial change in transportation technology going on, namely that the steam vessel starts to systematically replace the sailing vessel, right? So it's also a remarkable point in world history, in that sense, that for the first time ever, the sailing vessel is being replaced by an alternative that has totally different characteristics. And actually the Suez Canal, as we're going to see, is instrumental for that change. Okay, so while this at a first glance looked like a pretty straightforward exercise, right? You have this massive change in transportation costs. Just look at the map, right? What does that do? By closer inspection, you see, well, there's quite a lot of things going on, and we might want to be careful about how to deal with that and how to take all that stuff into account. It's not all that straightforward after all. So before I then really show you what's happening to the composition of trade and all that, let's think how the Suez Canal really affected trade costs. I came up with these three effects here. Maybe there are more, but I think these are the most important ones. First of all, and most directly, the opening of the Suez Canal reduces the distance and the time you need to get, for example, from Plymouth to Bombay. Okay, it doesn't affect other trade routes, but it affects, you know, a couple of trade routes very dramatically and very directly. Trivial thing. But secondly, the Suez Canal also affected the technology. Right? I said something in a second about that. And then finally, the Suez Canal opening had that effect on shipping costs, and that also then, but only over time, had an effect on freight rates. Because how is this world of international trade organized? Well, you had producers and you had shipping companies, and the shipping companies would provide a service at a given cost, right? The freight rate they charge. If now the technology that these shipping companies would be able to use is changing, maybe at the beginning they would actually be able to pocket in very, very large profits, because they can actually use a cheaper technology but still charge these old freight rates. But over time you'd think maybe there's a competition effect setting in, and the freight rates would respond to that change in shipping technology. That's also something that would then operate only with a time lag. So when we're talking about, you know, these trade costs, what I have in mind is actually the trade cost from a ship owner's perspective, but that doesn't translate immediately into freight rates, or at least not necessarily. The assumption would be there's sufficient competition in shipping going on, right? Now, why is there this link from the, just a second, oh no, oh yeah, go on.
You just got the cost, so do they charge any money for passing through this?
Yeah. They also charge money passing through this canal, very good point. Do I come back to that? I come back to that, but still, let's say something about that now, because then you might think, wait a second, this is a for-profit company, right? They have opened this magnificent canal, but if they want to make profit, how are they going to charge ships passing through the canal? They're going to charge them at the margin, right? So you actually think, okay, now the alternative is to go around Africa. That looks like a pretty big detour. So they can probably make quite a lot of money. And that, of course, is the original plan, right? So while maybe the British would use the canal, the French would actually still manage to control quite a lot of what's going on and benefit from that hugely. After then the British government buys that huge share of 44%, together with smaller shares, then actually had a controlling majority in the company, and that is a game changer, right? And that has effects on what's going on there. Yeah.
Can you rule out that the shipping companies were different in terms of which route they served? So there may be one shipping company, because one big thing of the time are liner conferences, which are monopolies basically on liner routes. So maybe there's a company, maybe even owning shares in the Suez Canal company, which is allowed to go through the, or has agreed to go on this route, and well, you know what I'm talking about. So that's actually not, that another reason for price differences is not the canal itself, but the companies running different routes.
Definitely. So actually, the shipping work back then is pretty opaque, and it still is today, right? So I think it seems to live from, you know, being intransparent, right? So you don't really quite know who owns what ship and what exactly they are doing. So in order, you know, and back then you had these cartels, right? The shipping rings, and they were trying everything in order to keep freights high. But you do have quite a bit of evidence that there is a big niche that's called tramps, not Donald. So ships that would be essentially freelance ship owners that would always try to undercut these freights, right? And there is a literature on that showing that they were pretty successful. And you also, I'm going to show you in a minute, the evidence we have shows that freight rates are systematically declining in response to the opening of the canal. Okay, now comes an important thing. It turned out that the canal was entirely unsuitable for sailing vessels. And that is essentially because of wind conditions, right? Sailing through the Red Sea is not a good idea, right? I mean, quite often you just kind of go to stand still, nothing's happening. So essentially, you would have to be toiled through the canal zone, right? And that turned out to be pretty expensive then. So after the opening of the canal, you see a boom in the British steamship industry that was not expected, right? Because it turned out that it was uneconomical to use sailing vessels for the canal. But in order to use a steamer, you would need a very highly efficient steamer. Because what is the logic if you would use a steamboat is, you know, back then in the early 1870s, these are essentially coal-devouring monster ships, right? So they need loads and loads of coal in order to get from A to B. So you would have to use a very efficient machine. The most efficient machine back then was the compound machine, in order to make sure that you don't use up all your space on the ship for the coal, right? So the less coal you need, the more cargo, of course, you can transport, and the more profitable that can be. Okay, so then after the opening of the canal, essentially the game is on to construct more and more efficient compound engines in order to economize more and more on coal. And guess that what that has really big knock-on effects on world shipping, because then these steamers become, in a very short period of time, way more efficient, and then they would reach all corners of the world, right? Where they were not efficient to use beforehand because they would need so much coal. Now all of a sudden, because of that essentially kick that this industry gets from the opening of the Suez Canal, you see these steamers conquering the oceans all over the world. Okay, and we're going to see some of that as well. So that is a very important effect. Number one, sort of the trivial thing that you see when you just look at the map. Number two, actually this more indirect but still very important effect that must kick in with a time lag. And then the third thing is that if there is sufficient competition, that also then should translate into freight rates, right? Okay, so we're going to look into essentially the trade between Plymouth and 6 ports, right? Bombay, Madras, Calcutta being Indian ports. Port Royal is a port in Jamaica, back then called the West Indies. And then you have Halifax, Canada, and Cape Town. Okay, so the direct effect of the opening of Suez Canal is you have, for example, a cutting down in the distance between these. That matters pretty much where you look. Of course, the effect is strongest for the port in the western part of India, right, related to Plymouth, and then the further you go away, the less important this distance saving by avoiding Africa gets, right? So therefore, you would expect to see the strongest effect of all that for the relationships between Bombay on the western part of India, closer to the Suez Canal, and Plymouth, less so for Madras, still less for Calcutta, and then even less, but maybe still there for the China trade. Okay. Now we actually took the pain to really try to calculate what was the effect of this opening of the canal on the shipping cost from the perspective of a ship owner. Okay, we do this based on a dissertation published in the 70s by Nick Harley. Nick actually is this K. It's his first name is Knickerbocker. I think this is brilliant. So Knickerbocker Harley, and he has this actually a basic setup that we then extend for our 6 destinations or voyages of interest. We distinguish between the so-called outward and homeward journey, or voyage. The homeward voyage is the import trade, right? From a UK perspective, import. I'm just going to show you later on import results on import, so essentially based on the homeward journey. And then we distinguish between steam and sailing vessels, right? And we look at the period 1856 to 1890. In 1890, essentially, nearly 100% of the vessels that were used are steamers, right? But you see this systematic transition happening there. And we always look into the per unit cost, and per unit here is actually the cost in British pound per 1,000 ton of cargo, okay? Okay, and now what are the elements of that cost? So you have the cost at sea, that is actually, so from a ship owner's perspective, the costs of sending a ship from A to B, and that includes the capital costs you had invested in that vessel, right? And that actually has to be evaluated, so how expensive is that, and what is the interest rate, and so on and so forth. The labor costs, right, you need a crew, and then of course also the coal. And you have to calculate somehow how much of this coal do you need in order to get from A to B, and how expensive is the coal. Then secondly, you have the cost of waiting in ports. Actually, back then it turns out to be relatively important. And the cost of the Suez passage. And our idea here is to say, well, only the coal, so the steam vessels go through the Suez Canal. All the others would actually go around Africa, because it's near impossible to sail through. Okay? Just to give you a feeling of the calculation that this involves, here's an example of the cost at sea for a steaming vessel. So what we do here is we first have to figure out, so we first get data on the average size of these ships that were used. Okay, the British were really good in statistics back then, so they have actually, for every year and every journey, so bilaterally, right, the ship sizes. So we know how big these steam vessels are, and we have their size in terms of, so the overall carrying capacity, and we can then calculate the relationship between the size of the ship and the displacement, and if we also know the typical speed at a given time, we can then calculate the power of the engine necessary to deliver that speed for a given ship size. Okay, and in order to do that, there's an approximation that's coming from engineering, but that was known already back then. That's called the Admiralty Constant. And that is this relationship. It's 250 for whatever. If you know the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the answer is 42. I don't know, it's 250. Believe these guys. We assume also that the ships would coal at specific points. We have evidence on that, but that again is actually kind of quite a complex thing, how they did that in order to really minimize costs. So we assume that for the homeward voyage, that is stuff that's coming, for example, from India to the UK, they would coal at Bombay or Madras or Calcutta, and then again at Port Said. And that would be sufficient to carry them back home to Plymouth. Now, the engines used back then were built by British engineers to use Welsh coal, and they were typically breaking down when they would use any other quality of coal. So they wouldn't even dare to use Indian coal. That implies that actually when we calculate later on the cost of coal, we have to take into account that this coal is actually Welsh coal, and they indeed did that. They first brought the coal from Wales through the Suez Canal to India, and then actually use it there to bring stuff back home. Okay, so we have to calculate that in. Okay, so we assume they're coaling in India and then again at Port Said. And then we know these voyage-specific ship sizes. We also have a lot of information about the types of ships that were typically used back then, their average speed, the voyage distance, that's the simple part, and what is actually the best available engine at a given point in time. And we have the Admiralty Constant, A, right? And we use these data to iterate that in order to get the engine size and then the implied coal consumption of that monster, right? And then that gives us the cost of coal, right? So that's just one part of the whole exercise to calculate these per unit costs. Okay, then the next thing is to calculate the cost of capital. That's simpler, and the cost of labor, that is also simpler. We would need the wages, right, that are relevant at the time for a ship crew. There's actually also data on that, and the cost of capital, and so on and so forth. Okay. This is just what's happening to the efficiency of these engines. That is massively increasing over time. So, okay, I think Anyway, so you see that the coal in pound, the coal consumption per indicated horsepower per hour, that is sort of the measurement of output that this engine gives you, is coming down dramatically. So you need less and less coal to generate the same amount of horsepower per hour. Okay, so these things are really improving, and you do see that apparently something is happening in the 1860s, and you can show more specifically really that there's this boom in the industry right after the opening of the canal, right? And they really okay. Now what you see here is a summary measure of an index of the cost of these per unit shipping costs. These are not the freight rates, it's actually the per unit shipping costs per 1,000 ton of cargo for a homeward journey going into Plymouth from different places. You have BEI, which is the British East Indies, that is Bombay, Madras and Calcutta, and then the others are the control group, which is Cape Town, Halifax and Port Royal in the West Indies. Okay, so what you see is that actually the average per unit costs are going down everywhere. This everywhere is coming from the fact that these steam engines are being used everywhere, but they are more, or they're first used in the India trade because it first pays to use them in the India trade. Before then they become more and more efficient and they are being used everywhere. Plus, of course, you have this just kind of distance effect, so that all of a sudden it becomes actually cheaper to do that. What is calculated in this is already, for example, the passage fees that you have to pay in order to go through the Suez Canal, and what is happening there, and that accounts for most of that divergence here, is that actually the British are sitting on the board of the company and make sure that the fees are going down. Okay, so it's in part it's the opening, in part it's the technological change in response to the opening, and in part it's also the British influence in the Suez Canal Company. So it's not all that simple what's going on here. Now this is what's happening for freight rates. Now freight rates are actually you can collect freight rates for specific journeys and for specific goods, right? While this picture that I showed you just before was from a ship owner's perspective, now this is what really matters from the trader's perspective, right? So what do I have to pay for that, right? It's not necessarily the case that the ship owner would actually give me the benefit of this reduced cost from getting from A to B. So this is the evidence we actually have for trade between England and North American East Coast versus England and West India, and that is just for grain, and it shows again that after 1870 the freights in the India trade are going more rapidly down than elsewhere, but they're going down everywhere. Okay, it's actually a similar picture as we've seen before. Right, now maybe it's finally time to say something about our results. What we do is we use now commodity-specific trade data for imports into the UK from different origins before and after the opening of the Suez Canal, and we have a difference in difference strategy. That is actually we look into the difference before and after the opening, and then we look into the difference of that before and after effect between those pairs that have been directly affected by the opening, the treatment group, so that is UK and India, against the difference in the control group, right? That is UK and other places. Okay? And now what is really important in all these exercises is what exactly is your benchmark? Against what do you measure? So here we don't just measure before and after the opening of the canal. Why? Well, because we know that so much is going on, so much that might affect, you know, these relationships other than just the opening of the canal. There is this general effect of course, the spread of the steam engine, which to some extent is triggered by the canal, but it's not, you know, exactly this. And there are other things that actually might affect the India UK trade. So we want to see, okay, how is that relationship before and after changing if we measure that against you know, before and after the opening of the canal in a control group. Now this control group are Canada, West Indies and South Africa. Why? Because if you do an exercise at the commodity level, you need other countries that trade these same commodities. Now if you look at the UK-India trade, you will be surprised to see how many different commodities they traded. So the UK imports from India grain, but they also import spices and hides, and they import jute and cotton. And now you have to come up with a bunch of other countries that have a similar commodity structure. And there is no single country in the world that has a similar commodity structure. So what we did is we actually look at a bunch of other countries that taken together then have, you know, all these commodities that are traded between the UK and India. Okay, that's the idea. To be honest, we could actually do better. We could take the universe, that is all the data on UK imports, and then construct a control group out of that universe of UK import data. We didn't do it that way. We actually took a shortcut and just looked at a bunch of other countries that were not directly affected by the Suez Canal, and taken together have a similar commodity structure. That's what we did. Okay, and we end up with 87 matched commodity groups, for which we have at least one observation both in the treatment and the control group at every point in time. So that we have a panel of data that is starting in 1861. This is actually the best we can do for all these you know, commodities and relationships. And over time, right? And now our definition of bulky is very simply if a good has a unit value that is below the median of all the goods traded at the time, then we call that a bulky good, right? We have played around with that. It's not very sensitive in this assumption, right? But this is a simple way to say what we mean by bulky. It's actually good that has a below median unit value. Okay, so value per ton. Actually, later on we'll just focus on those goods that can be measured in kilo. Because you have a lot of stuff that is traded, but it can't be measured in kilo, like whatever, or it's typically not measured in kilo, like books or steam engines, right? So we have evidence on all that, but we have to take that out of our picture because it just is not clear what really we are comparing, right? Because our effect, our composition effect is very much about the relationship between the per unit costs, right, and the per unit price, and we have to be clear what we mean by per unit and how we compare that across commodities. So we just look at stuff that actually can be measured in kilo. It's quite a lot of goods though still, right? And we have also done the whole exercise with a broader setting, and the big results are still there. Anyway, so we estimate the difference effect of opening the canal on overall trade, right? So before and after, control versus treatment, two differences. And then we estimate the difference effect, right? That is the first thing, but distinguishing between types of goods, and especially bulky goods versus non-bulky goods. Okay, and our intuition was from this theoretical section that the effect should be actually really driven by this composition change. And then finally, we will actually use our complicated trade costs measure, on which we have spent ages to generate, to explain away these findings from the difference and the triple difference evidence. Hope it becomes clearer in a second. Maybe it becomes clearer if I show you just some pictures. So this is the share of the British East Indies in the total sample imports over time, right? So if you would think that maybe after the opening of the Suez Canal, there should be way more imports from the British East Indies, you're going to be disappointed by that, right? That is not exactly what happens. So it's first going down, and then it recovers, and then it stabilizes at some level. Well, no. So if you just would, have a simple trade model, and you say, well, trade is a function of stuff and trade costs should go down, so there should be an expansion of trade. It's not that simple. If you just look at quantities, you are getting more of a picture that is in line with this initial intuition, maybe, that actually after the opening of Suez Canal, there is more trade into the UK coming from India in terms of quantities, right? Now, where might that difference come from? The difference between what we've seen for values and the difference that we've seen for quantities? Well, exactly if the argument is, well, there is this composition change, and what you see after the opening is more of a trade in bulky stuff that is in low value stuff, you see much more of an effect in quantities than in values, right? Because there's actually much more cheap stuff that is traded now, right? And if you now look at a different dimension of the data, so first that was just overall trade, now you look at bulky goods as a share of total imports from the Indies, you see, actually, even in terms of value, that seems to be there, while bulky is defined as being low value. And if you look at quantities, it's becoming even a bit clearer. So bulky goods as a share of all imports from the East Indies in terms of quantities are definitely expanding. And now we do the triple difference, right? So that picture is something you have to glance at, more than 1 second. So you have 3 things here. So you first have this time dimension that is sort of the red line being Suez Canal, so that's before and after Suez Canal. And then you have the share of bulky in all imports, right? And then you have actually British East Indies and the control group. And what you see is that the bulky goods are becoming more important in all goods over time, right? Mind you, on the scale here, that's 5, 10, 15, 20%, so it's not so much. But this effect is actually more clearly visible for British East Indies than for the control group. Okay? And that is quantities, and it's even clearer for quantities. Okay? And now, after I've shown you, these pictures, we essentially do that in an estimation framework. And we estimate that with a Poisson estimator. So essentially the stuff that we want to explain is trade or imports that arrive in the UK from different origins and in different commodities. Okay? And we only look at stuff that can be measured in kilo, and we have excluded cotton to be honest, the results survive if we include cotton, but we do exclude cotton because of the cotton famine that is just happening in the 1860s, and that is exactly working in the opposite direction, but we know where that is coming from. Right? That is the US Civil War. It's not related to, you know, so that's why we take that out of the picture. The results would survive if we would include that, but I think it's neater to take it out. Okay, so what we are interested in is now, what is the effect of opening the Suez Canal that is captured by this thing called Suez. Suez is a time dummy that is 1 after 1869 and 0 before. And then we say, well, that effect, you know, after before should be different for British East Indies trade relative to the control group. So we have you know, a constant, we have the time dummy, that's just called Suez, right? We have the British East Indies, right? The time dummy Suez itself says that after the opening of Suez Canal, for all these different trade relationships, trade is expanding, right? But then we say, well, actually, is that stronger for the British East Indies? That's this interaction effect, and that says, yes, it is, right? So there is, on top of that general trend in, you know, trade growth, there is this positive interaction effect telling us that yes, there's something that is specific here. And that is there for both quantity and value, right? But that is sort of the trivial thing, right? We have the decline in trade costs, well, obviously, right, there should be something. Okay? The next step is now to look whether that effect of overall expansion of trade after the opening of Suez Canal in the British India trade is indeed driven by the bulky goods, as we have suggested at the beginning. And what we find is that, yes, it is entirely driven by bulky goods, right? Because if we add now this triple interaction, it entirely kills the other effect. It goes away. It's not there anymore. So it really is, and that is maybe a not so entirely trivial or expectable result. It's this expansion in trade between the UK and India is entirely driven by what we have defined as bulky goods. And the final step is now to say, okay, fantastic, so that there seems to be this composition going on, this composition effect, but is that really, can that really be explained by trade costs, by these per unit trade costs? So now what we do is we actually take our estimates for the per unit trade costs and plug that into this. So we have a panel for every point in time and every bilateral relationship. We actually have an estimate, and we put that into this. And what we see is that it actually explains away the effects that we've seen earlier, right? It does so very neatly for quantities. It doesn't entirely kill the effect for for value here. To be honest, that is to some extent still a bit puzzling, because it seems to be there in if you just look at the figures. But it's also clear that the effect generally should be stronger for quantities as such, because when you look at values, you always have these opposing effects that with the change of composition towards more low value goods, obviously the general value is declining. Okay, so essentially these are the results, right? If you have expected much more, then that's a disappointment. So that are the results, and I actually want to stress again that this is something that maybe is in line with basic intuition and common sense, But our contribution is here to first have, formalize that in I think, a pretty simple framework, and secondly, come up with real evidence that this is quantitatively important, right? And that this really is what's driving this trade expansion after the Suez Canal. Now, quite often, so maybe you can ask yourself, well, somebody must have done that already, right? That sounds maybe like something that somebody has already done, but it's not the case, and maybe that the reason is that it's not that trivial to come up with the necessary data. Quite often, when people try to explore economic integration, they're looking at price data, and they would look whether prices have similar dynamics in different places, whether prices would respond to each other. If so, then that would be an indication for an integrated market. Now, that makes only sense if you really have price data at different points in time, at a reasonable high frequency, and for goods that are directly comparable. So where you can be sure that actually these prices are prices of at least very close substitutes. Now, typically people have only this type of data for grain. That's, you hardly ever have that for other types of goods, which already rules out any exercise on the composition of trade, right? Because typically you have just that evidence for one type of good. You can't say anything about the composition. Alternatively, people might have looked into trade flows, but so far at least the historical trade data that we have is mostly for aggregated trade. So we have data on the total trade between Germany and France and so on, or for actually some scattered parts of the trade balance, like we have good data on grain trade, but we don't really have the entire universe of trade for all different commodities that we would need in order to say something about composition changes. So what we have done here is actually to come up with a commodity level panel of trade data that would allow us to do that. And another thing that is maybe now more relevant just for the economists here is that actually people normally look at these relationships using a gravity framework. And the gravity model is actually a general equilibrium model where trade has effects on also on income, right? And these income effects then can feed back into trade. So it's a general equilibrium framework. But this is done with relatively strong assumptions, and one of the assumptions is typically that trade costs are proportional to the value of the goods traded. That actually rules out by definition that there are going to be composition effects, right? So you would have to take these per unit trade costs explicitly into the model. People have done that already, but actually not in the sense we have done it here, namely that you have per unit commodity-specific trade costs, right? Okay, so let me just conclude, and then maybe we still have some time for discussion. We think that we can show that the opening of the Suez Canal really triggered for the relationship between, at least between Britain and India, the onset of globalization in the sense of long-distance trade in bulky commodities like grain that then would have an effect also on the allocation of resources. It would free labor, for example, in the UK. Of course, a lot of the grain then at the end of the day is not coming from India, but it's rather coming from America. But it would actually have these allocation effects. And that is what economists say or call globalization. In contrast to long-distance trade that has been observed much earlier, but that was not in bulky commodities. Okay, or if it was in bulky commodities, then not over long distance. While at the first glance, maybe that was like kind of a pretty straightforward setup. By closer inspection, you see, oh, there's quite a lot of stuff going on, right? It's a complicated world. You also have not just this opening of the canal, but you have this implicit change of technology. You have to take that into account. And then once we did that, we actually produced evidence in favor of our initial hypothesis and can show, I think, that indeed the changes in the per unit trade costs are a driving force behind that. And that's it from my side. Thank you.